If someone ever told you that you didn't deserve what you earned, that you didn't belong in your own family's legacy, and you've been grinding in silence ever since, this story is for you. Don't skip it, because you're not alone. And this is how we rise. The air in the lawyer's office was thick with the scent of old paper and stale grief. It was a mahogany and leather cage, and I felt like an animal trapped inside. My cousins, Mark and Leo, sat across the table, their shoulders broad in their somber, ill-fitting suits. They couldn't quite hide their smirks, a subtle, predatory gleam in their eyes that they probably thought was invisible. My uncle, their father, sat beside them, his face a mask of practiced solemnity, a performance of sorrow he'd perfected over a lifetime of corporate negotiations. And next to me, my own father sat in a silence so profound it was like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, sucking the oxygen from the room. Mr. Abernathy, the family lawyer for as long as I could remember, a man whose jowls seemed to sag with the weight of our family's secrets, cleared his throat. He avoided my gaze, his eyes fixed on the stack of documents in front of him. As per the final will and testament of Mr. Thomas Sterling, he began, his voice dry as dust. The entirety of the estate, including Sterling and Sons furniture and all associated properties and assets, valued at approximately $5.2 million, is to be divided equally between his grandsons, Mark Sterling and Leo Sterling. The words didn't crash over me like a wave. They slid into my bloodstream like ice water, slow and lethal. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry out. My spine went rigid, my hands clasping so tightly in my lap that I could feel my nails digging into my palms. 8 years. 8 unpaid years. My entire 20s poured into that business, a ghost in the machine that kept it running. I was the one who redesigned the website when it was still a relic from 1998. I was the one who stayed up until 3 a.m, negotiating with a lumber supplier in Oregon, because Grandpa couldn't figure out time zones. I personally answered every customer complaint, soothing ruffled feathers and saving sales my cousins would have let walk away. My best designs, sketched out on diner napkins over cold coffee, were now their best-selling pieces. I forced myself to look at my father. His jaw was set, a muscle twitching near his ear. His eyes were fixed on a spot on the polished table as if it held the secrets to the universe. He was a statue carved from disappointment and complicity. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was letting it happen. In his silence, he was a co-conspirator, the most damning kind. "Danielle," Mr. Abernathy said, finally daring a glance in my direction, his expression a weak cocktail of pity and professional distance. "Your grandfather, he did leave this for you." He slid a single, crisp white envelope across the table. It seemed to travel a mile. My hand trembled as I reached for it, the paper cool and clinical against my skin. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a check. The letter was short, printed from a computer in a sterile Times New Roman font, not my grandfather's sprawling, elegant script. "Danielle, it's best for family harmony if you start something of your own. We wish you the best." It was signed by my father, Robert Sterling, and my uncle, David Sterling. 2 neat, authoritative signatures at the bottom, not my grandfather. My grandfather, who taught me how to tell oak from ash by the feel of the grain under my fingertips, whose workshop smelled of sawdust and lemon oil, a scent that was more home to me than my own bedroom. The man who called me his secret weapon. The check was for $1,000. A severance package, a dismissal, an erasure, for 8 years of my life. Mark snickered, a small, ugly sound he tried to cover with a cough. Leo just stared at me, a flicker of something, pity maybe. In his eyes, that was somehow worse than the contempt. It was the look you give a stray dog before you call animal control. I folded the letter neatly, the creases sharp and violent. I tucked it and the check back into the envelope and placed it gently on the table. A cold knot of certainty was forming in my gut, the certainty that the document they held was a forgery, a fraud, a lie. He wouldn't have done this. Not the man who'd held my hand just 6 months ago and told me his plans. Not him. I stood up. The chair scraped against the hardwood floor, a raw, grating sound in the suffocating silence. It was the only protest I allowed myself. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Abernathy," I said, my voice unnervingly calm, a stranger's voice. I walked out of that office without looking back. I didn't need to. The silence of my father followed me down the hall, a ghost that would haunt me for years. He didn't just let them erase me. He held the pen. My childhood was a masterclass in being second best, a lesson taught in 1,000 subtle cuts. My father saw the world through a prism of patriarchal tradition, a sepia-toned photograph from a bygone era. Sons were assets, legacies in the making. Daughters were decorative, temporary. He and my Uncle David were thick as thieves, their bond forged in the shared belief that the sterling name was a kingdom to be passed from man to man. Their sons, my cousins, were the extensions of their own egos. Mark and Leo were real men, praised for their clumsy attempts at woodworking while my meticulous sketches were ignored. They were celebrated for C-grade report cards while my straight A's were met with a distracted, "That's nice, honey." Holidays were the worst. The men would gather in the study, talking business and drinking whiskey, their boisterous laughter echoing through the house. I was taught to set the table, to help in the kitchen, to be a gracious hostess in a home that never quite felt like mine. My father called them worthy heirs. He never said the words, but the implication was a brand on my soul. You are not. My mother was my buffer, my quiet rebellion. She saw me. She'd find me in Grandpa's workshop, brushing sawdust from my hair with a soft smile. "You have his eye, you know," she'd whisper, as if it were a secret we had to keep. "The artist's eye." She bought me sketchbooks and drafting pencils, hiding them from my father's dismissive gaze. She was the one who encouraged me, who told me my worth wasn't determined by my gender. When she died of a sudden aneurysm when I was 19, the last shield between me and my father's quiet disapproval vanished. The color drained from my world. I thought her death might change him, might crack open his heart and make him see the daughter who was grieving right beside him. Instead, he tightened his grip. The freedom I'd had, limited as it was, evaporated. Suddenly, my life was subject to his audit. He co-signed for my first car and kept a copy of the key, just in case. He demanded to see my bank statements, clucking his tongue at what he called frivolous spending, a new pair of jeans, a dinner out with friends. "A woman needs to be careful with money," he'd say, the unspoken addendum hanging heavy in the air, because it isn't really hers. The only place I felt I truly belonged was with my grandfather, in the beautiful, chaotic mess of his workshop. After I graduated college with a degree in design and marketing, he was the one who said, "Danielle, the business needs you. It needs new blood, my blood." He gave me a dusty corner of his office at Sterling and Sons. There was no title, no salary. It was helping family, a phrase I would come to despise. For 8 years, I helped. I dragged his 19th century business model into the 21st century. I built an e-commerce platform from scratch, taught him about social media analytics, and redesigned the catalogs that had looked the same since the 1980s. I'd work all day in the office, then spend my evenings in the workshop with him, learning the soul of the work. He'd run his gnarled, strong hand over a piece of reclaimed barn wood, his eyes lighting up. "Look here, Danny," he'd say, his voice a low rumble of passion. "This wood has a story. It's seen 100 summers, 1,000 storms. Our job isn't to just make a table. It's to let the story keep talking." One evening, about a month before his stroke, he told me his secrets. We were alone in the workshop, the air sweet with the scent of cedar. He told me he was leaving the business to the three of us, me, Mark, and Leo. "They've got the name," he'd said with a wink, tapping the side of his nose. "But you've got the soul, kid. They'll need you to keep the heart of this place beating." He'd been working with Mr. Abernathy on it for months, he said. He was structuring it so I would have a controlling interest in the creative direction and product design. He called me his legacy. He saw me. 2 weeks later, he had a massive stroke. He never spoke another coherent word. He was gone within a month. And then I was in that office, with a $1,000 check and a letter telling me to get lost for the sake of family harmony. The lie was so blatant, so cruel, it was almost elegant. They hadn't just cut me out. They had used my grandfather's death, his vulnerable, silent state, as an opportunity to rewrite the history he intended. My father and my uncle had either found the real will and destroyed it, or they had convinced a dying, incapacitated man to sign a new one. I'd never know for sure. All I knew was the bottomless, echoing chasm of their betrayal. The first few weeks were a blur of gray. I paid my rent, which left me with exactly $817 to my name. The $1,000 check sat on my kitchen counter, a monument to my family's contempt. I couldn't bring myself to cash it. It felt like accepting their terms, like a signature on a confession that I agreed I was worth nothing more. I'd walk past it and feel a wave of nausea. I'd lie awake at night in my small, quiet apartment, the hum of the refrigerator amplifying the silence. The words from the letter would loop in my head. It's best if you start something of your own. It was meant as a dismissal, a condescending pat on the head to the little girl they were shooing out the door. Go play with your little hobbies, Danielle, while the men run the world. But as the sharp edges of grief began to dull, replaced by a cold, hard resolve, the words started to change their meaning. It was like turning a stone over and over in my hand until it was smooth. They weren't a dismissal anymore. They were a dare. They were a prophecy. One morning, I woke up before dawn, the decision made. It wasn't a lightning bolt of inspiration. It was a slow, quiet dawn of certainty. I wasn't going to fight them for what was my grandfather's. That legacy was tainted now, poisoned by their greed and my father's cowardice. I was going to do exactly what they told me to do. I was going to start something of my own, and I was going to build it so high it would cast a shadow over everything they had stolen. I finally walked to the bank and cashed the check. It felt like swallowing poison, but it was a poison that would become my antidote. I needed the money. Added to my meager savings, it gave me a pathetic war chest of just over $1,800. I went to a pawn shop and bought a used orbital sander, a set of chisels, and a few cans of high-quality stain and varnish. The rest went to overdue bills and groceries. My new workshop was my garage. It was cold, damp, and lit by a single, buzzing fluorescent bulb that cast long, dancing shadows. My first project was a coffee table I found splintered and abandoned in an alley behind a bakery, lying next to a dumpster. It was ugly, painted a hideous shade of pea green, one leg wobbly, but the wood underneath was solid pine. I spent 2 days stripping it, sanding it, my muscles screaming in protest. My hands, once accustomed to a keyboard and a sketchpad, were soon covered in blisters and splinters. I cried once, out of sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. But as I worked, something shifted inside me. The rhythmic scrape of the sander, the smell of the raw, naked wood, the intense concentration it took to bring out the beauty hidden beneath the ugliness. It was therapy. It was meditation. It was a way to channel the silent, screaming rage into creation. I was taking something broken and discarded and making it whole again. I was doing it for myself. I finished the table, staining it a deep, rich walnut that made the grain pop like a tiger's stripes. I reinforced the wobbly leg, making it stronger than it had ever been. I remembered what Grandpa had said about stories, so I took a picture of it with my phone, setting it up against the one clean back wall of the garage. I started an Instagram account. I didn't just post the picture. I wrote the story. This table was left for dead in an alley. Someone thought it was trash, but the wood underneath was strong. It just needed someone to see it, to sand away the ugly paint and heal its wounds. It's seen a lot, this wood. Now it's ready to be the center of a living room, to hold coffee cups and books and maybe a few pairs of tired feet after a long day. It's not just a table. It's a second chance. I'm calling it the Phoenix. It sold in 2 hours for $300 to a woman in another state who said my caption made her cry. That was the beginning. My business, which I named Reclaimed, was built on that principle. I didn't just sell furniture. I sold stories of redemption. I scoured demolition sites, flea markets, and barn sales. I sweet-talked farmers into letting me haul away the wood from their collapsed sheds. I spent my days covered in grime and my nights writing captions, building a website on a free platform, and responding personally to every single comment and direct message. There were so many setbacks. A beautiful oak headboard I'd spent a week on cracked right down the middle when I was applying the final coat of sealant, a casualty of the temperature fluctuations in the garage. I sat on the cold concrete floor and cried, not just for the wood, but for the wasted time, the lost money, the bone-deep exhaustion, and the fear that I was going to fail. There were weeks I survived on ramen and hope, watching my bank account dwindle, terrified I wouldn't make rent. One time, a client who commissioned a large dining table refused to pay the second half, claiming it wasn't what she'd envisioned. I had to rent a truck to go get it back, losing hundreds of dollars I didn't have. but the small victories kept me going. The first time a customer sent me a picture of my piece in their home, glowing under their dining room light. The first time a small design blog mentioned my work. The day I hit 10,000 followers, and my DMs were so flooded with custom orders I had to create a waitlist. I was working 18-hour days, fueled by cheap coffee and a stubborn refusal to let them be right about me. Each finished piece was a brick in the fortress I was building around myself. I never heard from my father, not once. Through the grapevine of social media, I saw that Sterling and Sons was struggling. Mark and Leo had the name, but they didn't have the soul. They tried to modernize by cutting costs, using cheaper materials, particle board and veneers instead of solid wood, and outsourcing labor. Customers noticed. The comments on their Facebook page were brutal. They were gutting the legacy my grandfather had spent 60 years building. A part of me felt a grim, dark satisfaction, but mostly, it just felt like another, deeper loss. They were burning down the house I grew up in. 3 years after I started sanding that first table in my garage, I got an email with the subject line, "Interview request Forbes." I thought it was spam. A prank. It was. A young, sharp journalist named Sarah came to my new workshop, a beautiful rented warehouse space with high ceilings and amazing natural light that I'd moved into 6 months prior. I had 2 employees now. I told her my story. Not the whole bitter truth about my family, but a carefully edited version. I talked about my grandfather's inspiration, about the philosophy of second chances, about building a brand from the ground up with nothing but $80, and a story to tell after my rent was paid. The article came out a month later. The headline was, "From the Garage to a Gorgeous Empire, How Danielle Sterling Turned Discarded Wood into a Multi-Million-Dollar Business." The phone didn't stop ringing for a week. The valuation in the article was an estimate, but it was an educated one. Reclaimed was worth, on paper, close to $7 million, more than the entire estate that had been stolen from me. That article was a seismic shift. It made me legitimate in a way that all the hard work hadn't, at least not to the outside world. The world my father lived in. 6 years after the day in the lawyer's office, I stood in the middle of my flagship showroom for its grand opening. It was a 5,000 square foot space in the city's trendiest design district. It was all clean lines, white walls, and warm light, with my pieces arranged like sculptures in a gallery. Each one had a small, discreet plaque, not with a price, but with its story. The elmwood bench, made from the beams of a 100-year-old Pennsylvania barn that was struck by lightning. The writer's desk, crafted from the floorboards of a defunct public library in Chicago. The room was packed. Designers, influencers, clients, and journalists mingled, sipping champagne. My team was buzzing, their faces glowing with pride. I felt a sense of peace so profound it almost brought me to my knees. I had built this, not from my grandfather's legacy, but from its ashes. This was mine. Then I saw them. First, my cousins, Mark and Leo, looking awkward and out of place near the door, clutching their drinks like life rafts. A few months earlier, Mark had sent me a clumsy, fawning email asking if I had any openings in my shipping department. I'd replied with a single sentence, "We are not hiring at this time." And then I saw my father. He was making his way through the crowd, a broad, practiced smile on his face, the kind he used at shareholder meetings. He looked older, grayer, but he carried himself with the same unearned confidence. He reached me, his arms open for a hug, as if we'd just seen each other last week. I didn't move. I just stood there, my glass of champagne held steady in my hand. "Danielle," he boomed, his voice full of a manufactured pride that was so loud it was offensive. "Look at this. Just look at what you've built. I always knew you had it in you." The lie was so audacious, so completely disconnected from our reality that I almost laughed. The years of silence, of disapproval, of control, all of it washed away in his mind by the glare of my success. He thought he could just show up with a smile and be welcomed back, claiming a piece of this victory as his own. He thought my success had absolved him. He thought it was his, too. I looked him dead in the eyes. The noise of the party, the clinking glasses and happy chatter faded away. It was just me and him, back in that silent, suffocating space that had defined our relationship for my entire life. But this time, the silence was mine. It was my power. You told me to start something of my own, I said, my voice low and clear, cutting through his smile like a chisel through soft pine. So I did. I let the words hang in the air for a beat. I watched the confusion cloud his features, the smile falter as the meaning landed. And you're not welcome in it. I held his gaze for a long moment, letting him see all of it, the years of pain, the nights in the cold garage, the blisters, the tears, and the unbreakable resolve. I saw a flicker of something, shock, maybe even shame, before his face hardened into the familiar mask of indignation, the expression of a man who cannot comprehend being told no. I didn't wait for him to respond. I didn't care what he would say. I had already said everything that mattered. I turned my back on him, walked over to a client who was admiring a dining table, and with a genuine smile, I began to tell her its story. If this story reminded you of a wound you've carried in silence, if you've ever been made to feel small by the people who should have made you feel safe, leave a comment that says, "I built myself anyway." Because sometimes the best revenge isn't fire or fury. It's a life well lived. It's a success they never saw coming. It's the quiet satisfaction of knowing you became everything they said you couldn't be, and you did it without them.